Mr. Milanovic, we have seen in the last month something like a revolt of the losers of globalization in USA, in Germany, in France, perhaps. Will this be some kind of battle of the losers of globalization? Will they win the fight against globalization?
I'm not quite sure on two things. First, the use of the word losers implies that these people have really lost in real terms something. They are not necessarily losers in that sense. They are simply their gains from globalization were less than the gains of the top 1% in their own countries, and certainly than the gains realized in Asia. So they are relative losers, but we cannot really assume that they are some poor people and they are really sort of in a very difficult condition. But positionally, they are in a difficult position because people who are richer than them gain, and people who are poorer on them gain as well. But the second thing is actually whether that would lead to a reversal of globalization. I'm not quite sure about that. And the reason why I believe is because I think that people who have come to power, or who might come to power, really don't have a consistent view on this. So what I'm more afraid is that there will be lots of inconsistent policy decisions that would not go in a necessarily reversal of globalization way, but by being inconsistent and chaotic, they can actually make the system become more chaotic. So I'm more afraid of a sort of a slightly anarchic next couple of years than some kind of really strong movement against globalization.
Well, having something like anarchy in the world economy, for me, would be a reversal of globalization, because globalization is what that you can calculate internationally, globally, what you are producing now and what you will sell next year. If you are in an anarchic condition, well, who can calculate?
No, I agree with you. Maybe let me just be more precise about the terms. What I meant as a consistent reversal of globalization would be, for example, like in the case of the Brexit, hard Brexit, abandonment of the single market, or slapping the tariffs, for example, on the Chinese goods, or including the tariffs, as Trump recently said, on German goods. That would be, or for example, France withdrawing from the euro. So that would be clearly, in my opinion, sort of measures. But what we might have would be also similar in the effect, but that would be a number of contradictory moves that would not be necessarily, I think, ideologically thought out movements against globalization, but rather sort of what they call it off-the-hip shooting, as we have seen with Twitter, like on a daily basis, and with lots of commotion, which then produces uncertainty, which, as you said, produces to some extent maybe a similar effect that people don't know what to do.
So possibly with this kind of strategy or non-strategy, those who have been relative losers might lose even more.
I think so. I think actually any movement, if it was really kind of a thought-out movement which would go against globalization, or this kind of somewhat anarchic sort of development, would certainly in the medium term and even more in the long term go against those who are actually, losers of globalization. Because what would happen is that even if temporarily in some cases their position might improve, this would be temporary improvement. What will happen is that the country where they are would also start losing, because that's the greatest danger, is that actually that we go back to the policies of the 1920s or the 30s of beggar thy neighbor, which actually then would make situation worse for everybody.
We have in the last 2 or 3 decades seen open societies, open economies in the West, working for globalization, and we have seen more or less protectionist governments in the rest of the world. Is this now shifting? Will the Asian countries be, at the forefront of defense of globalization?
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, because when you look at this, I think it was Pew Research that actually had the results of support for globalization in different countries. Asian countries like India and China, Indonesia, and so on really dominate actually support for globalization. And Western countries are relatively, low placed. And indeed, it is quite a big change, although we didn't have studies like that in the past. But I believe that probably 20 years ago, most of the public opinion, and if people were asked in the West if they were for globalization, they would have been in favor.
Yeah. We have seen, as far as I know, a reducing of inequality in the world, reducing of inequality between China, India, and the West, and so on. Will this go on in the future, or will we get back to more unequal?
I think that for the global inequality, we have seen a reduction of global inequality certainly, I think, over the last 15, 20 years. And the largest, the engine of the reduction of global inequality is China, up to, 2000 something. And then, of course, now China and India together. And these are really powerful engines. So it is a huge development. I think it's extremely hopeful development. It reestablishes, if you will, eventually would reestablish the relative income positions of the Asian mass and the European mass. Is that actually they would go back to before the Industrial Revolution, where obviously the differences between China and Western Europe were much smaller. So I think it's a very hopeful development. The dangers, however, is that we have had, compared to 20 years ago, we have had significantly higher inequality. We have significantly higher inequality now. And that's where this issue of derailment of globalization comes from, particularly from the dissatisfaction in the Western countries. And that can put into danger that very hopeful development of sort of more equal world that we have seen.
Perhaps one last question. I was puzzled that you put China and India together in one phrase. Right. Is it just statistically putting together them, or is it possible that China and India will become some kind of trade bloc or some kind of influence bloc in the world? No,
I really thought actually statistically putting them together because of their size and because of the dynamic growth. But if I may conclude, just I would like to make one point because going back to our point about dissatisfaction of the elites and dissatisfaction of large part of people in the West. I'm actually, I'm not as pessimistic as many people are. And let me explain why. Because I think the West had a very sort of brilliant moment in the 1990s, where this is the belief of the Washington Consensus, the Fukuyama end of history. And I thought it was always exaggerated that actually the sort of a triumphalist moment of the West never seemed to me that it should have been so triumphalist because there are other forces in the world, and the West just decided to forget about it. So I think there was an overreaction then. And I think there is a little bit of, in my opinion, overreaction now, because disappointment may be behind the West if you sort of take the position of the 1990 as the normal position. But if you take the position of the 1990 as a special position, then I'm much more optimistic that we are now talking about some relatively important bump on the road, but not about a major sort of disaster.